over kind of some of the real common things that we see in our plan reviews to give you guys an opportunity to shore these things up, maybe understand what we're looking for to get a better shot at getting these approvals through the first time. Save yourself a little bit of headache and a little bit of time for your customers so that you can get these projects and permits out a little bit quicker. I'll try and keep an eye on the questions on the right as I can. Depending on what kind of time we have, how much questions I'll be able to take going forward, I will try to answer as many as I can. So we'll get right into it. One of the biggest things we have, this first three is kind of going to all be related, is when we get revisions, we need a revision narrative. And we also need to mute our personal phones. So sorry about that. We get a revision, and sometimes these revisions are on sets of plans that are 200-300 sheets. They'll submit a whole set of plans to us. What we really need is a revision narrative that tells us sheet by sheet what's on there, what's being done, what's being changed from the original approved drawings, and then we need to cloud it on the plan so that we know exactly what's changing with the delta. If we don't have that, it leaves us on a scavenger hunt. It takes a long time to review. Our jurisdiction and the other jurisdictions I know of, the revisions come in, they're not a base fee, they're an hourly fee. So not only does it take longer to get those things out, but it also costs more to get it done because you're paying for those reviews by the hour. And in Clark County specifically, with our digital plan rooms, when you upload the drawings, you only need to upload the sheets that are affected, and you need to make sure that the sheets are named the same as the previous uploaded sheets. So if the sheets didn't change, we don't want to see those again. Second one is the scope of work. The scope of work is kind of where it all starts in our plan review. So we need to know what exactly are you doing. So we get a lot of these scopes of work that say we're renovating the existing office space or building new offices. Well, that doesn't really tell us what's going on in the project. What we really see is something more like we're demoing the existing offices and storage rooms, adding offices and break room, installing new fixtures in existing bathrooms, replacing flooring and finishes in existing conference room. So it gives us an idea. These rooms are staying the same. We're just freshening them up. These rooms we're tearing out and rebuilding them. Or if we're adding on to the building or we're subtracting from the space, like we need to know that up front because it's going to affect how we review that set of plans. And without a clear scope, we don't know what's new, what's not, and we could be applying codes that don't really affect you, or we could be doing stuff that's going to we're going to be giving you bad comments and bad feedback that we're going to go 2 rounds of comments and cost you additional time. And you're going to be frustrated with us. We're going to be frustrated because it's going to cause some communication issues. Code analysis is another big one that's either missing entirely or we don't have the information that we actually need to do a proper code review. So the code analysis first step that we do when reviewing the project, because you can't understand what parts of the code that we need to apply and what is being built or altered on the building. When we don't have enough information in the code analysis, we often can't complete the review. We need to know construction type and the occupancy classification before we can even look at the building height and area tables to determine whether this building falls within the parameters of what's allowed to be done. And then we also need to know if the building is sprinklered or not, because that determines what allowable increases we can apply to the building. We need to know how far it is from the property lines, so we know if we're allowed to take area increases for frontage and make the building a little bit bigger than the minimum tables. Also, do we have to fire rate windows? Do we have to fire rate walls? Do we have to fire rate eaves? All that stuff comes into play based on the code analysis telling us what those separation distances are and those construction types are and the occupancy classifications. So this complete code analysis, as you can see, I've got a list here on the screen. We're going to need the occupancy classifications, the load factors, the actual floor area and allowable floor area, the actual height and allowable height, the actual number of stories and allowable number of stories. And you're going to need an exit analysis, what the fire protection requirements are. That includes the fire rating, fire smoke alarm systems, and fire alarm systems and sprinkler systems. What your IECC compliance method is, and we'll talk about that one later, but that's a really important one that's causing a lot of issues right now. As I'm sure you guys are all aware, this energy code is becoming a lot of changes and updates that we're trying to meet. And then lastly, the plumbing fixture analysis to know what the required number of plumbing fixtures are so that we can make sure when we're going through the review, we have those minimums. So the code analysis kind of looks a little different depending on anybody has it. You can see these ones say project data. This one says code analysis. This one says project description. What's really important is that the information, the minimum information is there. So while these all look very different, you'll notice that they all have the same basic information that we covered on the previous slide. And the other issue with the code analysis we see is that be mindful of the jurisdiction you're submitting to, because while local jurisdictions work closely with each other to develop uniform standards, they adopt slightly different code amendments. For example, Clark County adopted 21 IECC, but we still use the 2018 IBC. And the city of Las Vegas and Henderson have adopted the 2021 IBC, but they still are on the 2018 IECC. So you have to be mindful of what jurisdiction you're submitting. Make sure that their currently adopted codes are listed in your code analysis, because those codes change and the rules change. So the next one that we see a lot of is there's a lot of confusion between occupancy classification and occupant load factor. So the occupancy classification is the primary purpose of the building. So the classification is designation placed on the building or portions of the building for the purpose of code analysis to determine allowable heights and areas and separation requirements. The classification is determined by the primary use of the building. In some cases, there is one occupancy classification, and in others, there's a mixed-use occupancy classification, or even a separated uses or non-separated uses. And you'll notice that there's only 7 categories of occupancy classifications. They're very broad terms. Your occupancy classification is going to be, a factory or a hazard or an institutional. Now, in those, I'm sure many of you are aware that there's an A1, A2, A3. There's different categories of occupancy classification. But this is really, how do we use this building and what does it do? So in some cases, occupancy classification is a mixed use occupancy classification. So a common example of this was an office with a conference room. So at your offices, you generally conduct your architectural business and you also have a conference room. The purpose of your business is to do architecture and design work. It's not to assemble people. So the conference room is an assembly use, and it's intended for people to assemble in a more concentrated area. The primary use of the office is still for business. With the conference room only playing a supporting role, we do not need to evaluate the building as an assembly occupancy classification and determine separation requirements, as it's not a significant function of the building. Now, if you had a large training room that exceeds 10% of the building, or an area was over 750 square foot for a single conference room, then you would need to evaluate it based on both occupancy classifications, and then it would become an assembly occupancy for that particular room because it's exceeding the accessory use levels. So unlike the occupancy classification, which is based on the overall use of the building, the occupant load factor is designated on the function of the room or space. So that's a really important distinction. While occupancy classification is in Chapter 3, occupant load factor is found in Chapter 10 in the egress section, and more specifically 1004.5 table. And an example of the conference room, it would be classified as either a B occupancy or an A occupancy, depending on the size of the room, but it's always an assembly use. So you would always use an occupant load factor of 15 or less. You would never use that 1 to 150 occupant load factor that you would use for a business use. So the occupancy classification, it is used in conjunction with the construction materials to determine the limits of the height and floor area and the number of stories and allowable for the building. And the occupant load factor is independent of occupancy classification, and it's based on the use of the room or space. And to be noted, a higher square footage per person is less restrictive. So the smaller number per square footage, the higher the occupant load is being done. And I do not see, it looks like I've got a Q&A. So bear with me. I'm trying to to deal with this question. I didn't realize I had one. So I had a question that says, do you receive plans for a large number of architects that lack this information, or are these issues most common with plans that are being produced and submitted by contractors? Unfortunately, yes, we do. We see a large amount of architects, and some of the architects that we see this from have been doing this for a very long time. They're well-established architects with very good reputations. This particular occupant load factor versus occupants classification, some of the architects I've had these conversations with are principals of the firm. They're well known, and they've done a lot of really big, important buildings in town. So yes, it does. It is not just the contractor prepared plans. So this, so if you notice, when we do the occupancy classifications, we have a lot of different options based on exactly what it is. So when you have your airport terminal, for instance, that's going to be an A3 occupancy, but each area, baggage claim, your baggage handling, your concourse and waiting areas, they all have a different occupant load factor. Another thing that gets a little bit misunderstood is this net versus gross. We just had a big conversation with a customer yesterday about the net. So when you're doing these net occupancies, in this case, they were trying to do one of these big playground areas, indoor playgrounds, and their occupant loads are pushing them into the limits of requiring a risk category 3 evaluation of the building. If you have tables that are bolted down, you have furniture that's built in place, that comes out of the square footage for the net. You do not have to add that. So it's a matter of, if you show the details on a plan showing that stuff is permanently attached to the building, then you can extract that square footage out of the total square footage to reduce your occupant numbers. So the other one that we see a lot of confusion on is a fire resistant rating for separation versus fire rating for protection of structure. And we have some confusion on this internally as well. I answer these internally, but I see it on the plans come in. So for fire resistant rating, it's broken into two separate areas. One is fire resistant protection of the structure itself. The other is to separate areas to keep the fire contained and out of the room. So you see here, the protection of the structure is based on construction type. It does not contain fire areas, and it protects the individual members. The separation is to separate the occupants or areas. It has to be an assembly, not a single material. When you get into chapter 6, your protection of structures is going to come out of this table 601, and it's going to be based on the primary and secondary members. And so the difference is, a lot of people think that if they give us 5/8 of drywall, that gives them a 1 hour rating. And so they say this wall's rated because I've got 5/8 of gypsum on it. Well, the gypsum material for a separation is actually not, it's not a valid rated assembly. Then we can't use it that way. When we come into this fire rated for protection, you can use a single membrane system to coat the material or encapsulate material. So we've got monocoat, which is your cementitious fireproofing. You can use intumescent paint. You can actually wrap it in gypsum board and protect it that way, or you can encase it in concrete or a fire blanket. And then when we get people trying to apply this, there's a lot of confusion of when the primary members and secondary members come in and what those look like. So when you're applying the ratings correctly, we need to understand what the primary member and what the secondary member is. The primary members are the columns and all the other members, such as the beams and the girders that connect directly to the columns. The secondary members are the members between the columns that are supported by the elements other than the columns. So if you have a chevron brace or other elements that are critical to the vertical stability of the columns, they're also considered primary members. So you got moment frames or brace frames or chevron frames that are supporting those columns. Those will become part of the primary structural frame. So you see in this one here, you've got these brown beams that they're being attached from one beam to another beam. So those are going to be your secondary members. And then these green ones are going to be your primary members. And then here's another example of how we can encapsulate this member. So this structural member is protected in the wall. And you notice you have the 2 layers of gypsum around the column itself. The rest of the wall does not need to be fire rated and does not require protection or opening penetration. So where I see this one the most and where we get the most debate on this topic is in an apartment building. So you typically have these apartments are getting bigger, so they're going from a 5B construction to a 5A construction. And the 5A construction requires the fire rating of the interior bearing walls. So the fire rating that's required for the interior bearing walls is out of Chapter 6, and that's fire rating for the structural protection. So we install the mud ring for the high-low entertainment outlets that you have in your living room, or when we install those electrical panels in those bearing walls, we don't have to put a fire-rated electrical panel. We don't have to put a fire-rated mud ring in those. And what we do have to do, though, is since there's a penetration in the outside membrane, the inside structural member is no longer protected. So we have to line that cavity that penetrating item is going into to protect the stud itself in the wall, because that's what we're trying to keep from burning. So you need to make sure when you have those situations and those apartments and other similar buildings where you have a fire rated wall that's rated for construction type, that if you do have to put a panel or something in there, that you give a detail on the plans of how you're going to protect the structure in the opening and that penetration. You put the electric panel in. And like I said, you typically are going to four-side that opening and basically line the inside of that cavity with drywall to protect it. So if you have 49 occupants, I got a question. If you got 49 occupants for an office building, do I not need individual rooms, break rooms, conference rooms, occupant load? So I'm not sure that I understand that question. So you will have, there's no requirement for when you need an occupant load. I need an occupant load for each room no matter what, because we need to see how you're factoring that, and we need to see what factors you're applying. And then I got another question. You will require UL or a similar listing for the details, correct? So if we're talking about the situation we're at right now, where it's structural protection of the members, I don't necessarily need a UL listing for the details, because I have prescriptive requirements in the code in Chapter 7 that will tell me what I could get for each piece of material. And so I'm only trying to protect the member itself. So unlike when I do separation, where I do require a UL listed assembly or symmetrical assembly, in this case, I do not have to do that. I can provide a rating for the material itself, and then I just apply it. So that's a good question, and that is one that we see a lot in this topic. So fire rating for separation, unlike the structural protection requirements in 6, fire resistant rating in the other areas of the code are for separation or compartmentalization of the fire areas. So these separate dwelling units create smoke compartments, separate occupancies, and separate buildings. And if I put the wrong buttons on my thing, so you can start jumping around really quickly. I apologize for making you guys dizzy on that one. I thought a solid 2x member provides 1 hour of protection. So a solid 2x member in some cases can provide 1 hour of protection. It's not necessarily 1 hour protection. It's actually a 1 hour char rating. And that comes out of the National Wood Design Manual. But if that member that we're trying to protect is the 2x4, I cannot use that as a sacrificial anode as the fire rated membrane. So when we see that is going to come into play here shortly, is that when we're doing these laminated timbers, where we're building solid wood floors on high rises, the fire rating on those is going to become from extra layers of 2x4 that are the sacrificial anodes that become the fire resistant membrane, but the actual required structure is going to be above those. So hopefully that answers your question on that one. And we do see that 2x member used in a code provision that we just got approved in this last code cycle last year that should be going into the 27. It's amended here locally in Southern Nevada, and that does allow for a solid 2x member inside the top of wall at the rated floor ceiling assembly, where the non-rated partition penetrates the ceiling, and that is a membrane continuation. So it is able to be used as a fire resistant member, but it's not necessarily a substitution for the structural protection act. The structural member itself has to be protected by something else. So if you wanted to put in an argument that that 2x4 was going to protect the other 2x4, it would have to be an additional. It could not be part of the structure itself. So, so we touched on this a little bit, but unlike the fire protection for structures where we're adding a single material to achieve the fire rating, the fire rated assemblies are required for fire separation. So you can use a listed assembly such as the UL or a gypsum association, or you can also use the prescriptive requirements out of Chapter 7 and you can build your own assembly. That one's a little less common. It can be done. When we get in a pinch that you can't find a UL assembly, then you can go to that chart. And there is a third option that it did not mention in this, and that's that you can get an engineering judgment stamped by a fire protection engineer for a special assembly and have that done as an alternate material method through your building departments. So many of the issues we have, which we touched on before, is that a lot of the designers think you can use a single layer of drywall to achieve a 1 hour and 2 layers of drywall to achieve a 2 hour, but it's just not how the code works. So the fire resistant rated assemblies must be protected from both sides. They must be an assembly that accounts for all the components, including the framing, the membrane on each side of the assembly, and insulation if needed. So a lot of this stuff, the insulation is optional, but some of these, the insulation is required. And those assemblies are going to need to tell you what the framing size is, the material, the thickness, the insulation, the sheathing pattern, the nailing, and the exterior finishes. So we get a lot of just simple details that say this is our fire rated wall section, but this is what we really need to be part of the plan sets. This is an actual UL assembly. It's got the UL number 338 up top. It gives you a diagram that tells you what it is, and it gives you the list of all the requirements for each one of those things and all the options that you're allowed to use. So for instance, under the gypsum board, you see that there's 6, 7 different companies of gypsum and brands of gypsum that you can use. One thing that you need to be careful of when designing these projects is the proprietary assemblies. So this is a detail that we'll see fairly regularly, but notice it says 1-inch Pabco gypsum shaft liner board type X. Well, if you come in and bring a Georgia Pacific product or a USG product out there, then it's going to fail in the field. So you need to make sure that if you're doing a proprietary system like this, that your contractors are aware that this proprietary system and that their brands of material that they're doing and whoever they're getting their supplies from matches what you specified as a prescriptive system. If they don't, then they need to know that early in the process so you can get a revision in, so that you can add another detail that allows the product from the manufacturers that they're purchasing through on their projects. So any more questions on that one before we move on? So this is another one that we see a lot of misunderstandings with, and that firewall is not a generic term. There is defined terms in the building code, and so they're broken into 5 categories. You have firewalls, fire barriers, smoke barriers, fire partitions, smoke partitions. Horizontal assembly is also shown in here, which isn't really, it's not confused as much. And the fact, the only thing we see with horizontal assemblies that's an issue is a lot of people, again, think they could do a fire rated ceiling. Horizontal assemblies are just like wall assemblies. It's either a floor ceiling assembly or a roof ceiling assembly. It has to be a symmetrical assembly and it has to have a top and a bottom. So the fire walls, these are your most restrictive. These are the ones that you're going to use to separate the structures. They extend through the roof and the exterior walls. There are some exceptions that allow you to stop at the roof if you extend the fire rating, 4 foot out on either side. And same with the exterior wall. Instead of penetrating the wall, you can kind of bump it out 4 feet on each side with a rated wall. And then they're unique in that if you put a firewall in, the structure has to be able to collapse on either side of the wall without affecting the structure on the other side of the wall. So when you do your townhomes and stuff, a lot of people use these firewalls to separate the the townhomes now, you're going to have those burn away aluminum clips on one side so that that side, the clips melt and that side collapses without affecting the house on the other side. And in commercial, you're going to have to make sure that your structural engineer is aware that you're using that as a firewall, because your structural engineer is going to have to design it to where each side can stand with or without that wall being there. So it's a little bit more of a complicated calculation. So the structural engineer needs to know that well ahead of time so they can make sure that your structural design is coordinated with your architectural design. So the firewalls are used for dividing large building into smaller areas, and to divide a building into different construction types, and for party walls. Party walls are a little unique, and then if we want to take a strip mall and we want to divide that strip mall and now we want to sell each suite out, then we can put a firewall in there that doesn't allow openings. The thing is, the firewalls are not supposed to have penetrations in it, but with a party wall, you can share utilities across boundaries, but you have to have a reciprocal use easement agreement on file with the building department in order to be allowed to use a party wall style firewall to separate those owners in what I would like to call a commercial condo type situation, to where they're sharing utilities, things are crossing boundaries. Typically, if you have a firewall to separate it into two buildings for ownership purposes, your meter, your water, your power, and everything has to be on each side of the firewall. So each owner has their own individual utility feeds. They don't share feeds across. The only time you can do that is using the party wall provision. So fire barriers. So fire barriers is your next step down from firewalls. It's the middle level of protection. Your wall assembly with a fire resistant rating designed to restrict the spread of fire. It's the continuity is maintained. So they must extend from the floor to the bottom of the floor or roof deck assembly. So they got to go all the way up to the bottom of the sheathing or the pan deck or whatever that deck is. And these are used for your exit enclosures, separating occupancies, creating fire areas, etc. Now, these are similar to the way shafts are built, but keep in mind, shafts, while they are built as fire barriers, shafts have their own set of rules. So if you're building a shaft, then that needs to go to the shaft section of the code and look at that for where you're going to get that construction. So then the least restrictive out of the fire rated walls is the fire partition. This is the one you're going to use the most. They only need to extend from the bottom of the fire rated floor ceiling assembly or roof ceiling assembly and to the bottom of the ceiling of the floor ceiling, roof ceiling assembly above. So this is your common fire rated wall that's used for your dwelling unit separations, your corridor walls, your elevator lobbies, your storage rooms, etc. Well, one detail that's often missed on the fire partitions is the fire blocking or draft stopping above the fire partition in combustible concealed spaces. So we see this a lot. Again, a prime example of I use apartments a lot because that's where a lot of these things really rear up their heads, is that the corridor wall fire partitions need to have a fire block or a draft stop that extends through the combustible concealed space to the deck. So if you read section 708.4.2, there's several exceptions to that, to where you can have 2 or 3 units kind of share the same space without between fire blocks. But you need to be aware that if you're doing a fire partition in a concealed space in the interstitial space is combustible, you're going to need to probably extend some kind of fire block or draft stopping above that space. That detail needs to be on your plans so that it gets captured in the field and the inspectors know where you are intending to put that. Otherwise, the inspector is going to require it in places you did not intend it to be. So lastly, we have the smoke rated walls. So fire rated walls don't necessarily have to be smoke rated, but the smoke rated walls are broken into 2 categories. You got smoke barriers and smoke partitions. Smoke barriers are fire rated smoke wall that extends to the deck like a fire barrier and is sealed for smoke patches. These are always required to be fire rated. Smoke barriers are used to create smoke compartments typically found in your institutional occupancies such as hospitals and jails where people need to be protected in place. So smoke partitions are unique in that they only need to stop the movement of smoke. So unlike all the other walls in this list that we talked about, they can have a membrane on one side only. The purpose of this is to contain smoke to allow the occupants more time to escape or be rescued. So be mindful when you're labeling these rated walls on your drawings that you're using the correct terminology to avoid additional review comments or additional requirements that aren't necessary. You don't want us to be trying to write you up for firewall issues when you're really only trying to put a fire partition in. So I've got the means of egress, common path. Before I get into that, does anybody have any questions on the difference of the fire ratings of these walls and where to use them? So this one, I was actually asked to put this one in, the common path of travel. A lot of people confuse this with the maximum egress travel distance, and they don't understand how to apply it. So the exit travel distance is the total travel distance from any point in the building to an exit, and the common path of travel is only the distance to the point I have a choice between two distinct exits or exit access components. So the path is measured across the most likely path of travel. Typically, this is applied by straight lines around the perimeter of the room. Since it's assumed the middle of the room will have furniture or other obstructions, the common path stops the moment the occupant has two choices. This does not mean I have to be able to see the actual door. It just means there are two exit signs that I can see. So that I stop the common path as soon as I can see those two exit signs. An example that we have here, you likely have an exit sign at the hall showing that the direction to exit on the left. And then when you came out, you would be able to clearly see the exit on the right. So your common path starts at the most remote point in the room, and it goes out there, and you see the second red dot. As soon as I get to where I can see 2 points, my common path of travel stops right there. So, and your common path of travel is typically designed to determine where I need a second exit or exit access doorway, and it is affected by whether I have sprinklers or not, and it's affected by the occupant load. So in most cases, it's the same, but if you can see here in the case of like a business occupancy, if I have less than 30 people in that room or space, I get 100 feet. If I have more than 30 people, I only get 75. If I have sprinklers, I get to go back up to 100. And so in your R1, R2, R3, you see that you have to have sprinklers, so it doesn't matter. But this table gives you a couple of options that you just need to be aware of. So another one, in this one, I struggle with personally because when I was doing architectural design myself, this was the basic tenet of how we design a building, is the accessible door maneuvering clearances. This one gets missed on 1 out of 3 plan reviews. We have an issue with the maneuvering clearance of the door. So hopefully we've all seen this from A117. So the door requirements could be found in A117 under section 404. The most common issue we see are not having the 18 inches on the pull side of the door. So every door must have at least 18 inches on the pull side of the door. So depending on the approach direction, that distance can increase. So if you look at some of these, I've got 42 inches or 36 inches or 22 inches. You can have more than 18, but there's not a case on an accessible door or a door on an accessible route that you don't need at least 18 inches on the pull side. And then the other one on the push side, if the door is equipped with a latch and a closure, it's got to have at least 12 inches. And the 12-inch requirements often missed at exterior doors. Your exterior doors almost always have a latch and a closure on them. So when you look at that figure on the upper left, there's an asterisk next to that 12 inches minimum. So I don't have to have that extra 12 inches, but if I put a latch and a closure, I do. So you can avoid that by specifying in your hardware schedules that there is no latch or there is no closure on a door, and you can eliminate that 12. But if it's on an exterior door, you need to very specifically explain why you don't have that 12 there, because otherwise we are going to apply that section to it and we're going to ask for it. The upper right image shows doors in a series. This one's not as common, but it does get missed. But I wanted to bring this one up because there's some confusion as when this gets applied. So this is when I'm exiting through one door and entering the other door to go through this space. Where it doesn't apply is when I have an alcove to where if I take one of these walls and one of these diagrams away, and I'm coming out of that door and I'm making a right turn to go from that bathroom alcove out, that is not doors in a series, and it does not apply with the same rules. It would just be a simple maneuvering clearance and turning space problem at that point. This is only when I need to go in one door and out the other in a series. Well, and then another one that we see that is becoming more popular as people try and get the most bang for their buck on the square footage is we're seeing a lot more pocket doors going into commercial buildings. So the pocket door rarely has a maneuvering clearance issue, but it often has a hardware problem. So the traditional flip up style latches on the pocket doors don't meet the grasping requirements. So, you can't require a pinching, twisting of the wrist or a tight grasping. Well, those little flip latches require you to pinch that little thing, put your finger in there and pop it up to pull the door open. So those ones don't meet it. So you end up having to put in a handle that you can pull or push from either way without having the benefit of having fingers or a hand. The issue with that is that you need to show that hardware and you need to clearly show on the plans how you're going to maintain that 32-inch minimum clearance when that door is in the open position, knowing that it cannot fully be docked into the wall like a traditional pocket door because you've got the accessible hardware on the outside. So there are obviously creative design methods that you can use to get around that to where you could conceal the wall. I'm sure there's some really fancy hardware out there that I just haven't seen that you can do that, but you do need to be aware when you're doing a pocket door, you really got to pay attention to your accessibility and how you're going to make that work. Okay, everybody's favorite topic, energy code requirements. We can't get crazy into this one. I know you guys have a ton of questions on this one. There's a lot of new things, and 24 is not going to disappoint. It's going to be even more new stuff. We are still trying to get our heads wrapped around this on the jurisdictional levels. I will mention that SNICC does have a lot of classes that we've done where we bring subject matter experts in. We have a lot of classes here at the building department. So if you want to sign up for the SNICC newsletter to where you can get on the mailing list and get notification of these classes, we have some of these people that come in and really explain exactly how to do these requirements and what to apply and how it affects our buildings. So if you get a chance to sign up for those classes, I really encourage it because this is a topic that is definitely hotly debated. So the first thing we need to do is we need to have these 13 specific items on the plan. So if you go into section 103.2, it's going to give you this list of 13 items that have to be shown on the plans. We're only going to concentrate on a couple of these, which is going to be the air barrier and the thermal envelope today. But it should be noted in 24, they're going to add 5 more items on that are going to have to be shown on the plan. Thermal bridging is one of them, but the energy storage systems, they're going to get real heavy into that coming into the next code. They're going to require you to have dedicated space for the energy storage system, whether you have one installed or not. They're going to have to show a location of the pathways for the conduit and everything that feeds the rooftop solar. So all that stuff's going to have to be shown on the plan. You're going to have dedicated space. So in January, when you start submitting under the 24, you need to be cognizant of these additional 5 items that were not on the original 2021 that we've adopted currently. So we were talking about the compliance path on the code analysis. The first thing we need to know when we're doing your energy is which compliance path are you using? So are you using the prescriptive or the performance requirements? So prescriptive requirements is the most common because you just go out of the tables in the book, you get your insulation, your solar heat gain coefficients and U factors for your doors and windows. You're just going strictly based off of that. So there's multiple ways to prove the building system meets the requirements in the IEC and other codes. The prescriptive path describes the means that each component or system meets a set of threshold for performance. This process works for most small and simple projects like a convenience store or a small TI, but it does not account for how different systems interact. So the HVAC system is looked separately from lighting. A performance compliance path is for more complicated projects and requires interdisciplinary coordination for a whole building approach. So you can use this one's going to end up involving an energy rater and some software. They're going to have to do some analysis. There may be some engineering analysis, and you're going to get some trade-offs. So you're going to have maybe a more efficient air conditioning system to offset less efficient insulation system, or maybe you can get away with a little less efficiency on your doors and windows if you increase the efficiency of your roof and wall insulation. So you get trade-offs in this thing. You don't have to use the prescriptive requirements as a minimum of this in every situation. Performance requirement is when you're going to use an actual calculated design. So we need to know which path you're going to use up front because it changes which code sections actually apply. So to evaluate the building, we need to know where the thermal envelope is located and what it's composed of. We need to know the R values of the insulation, the U factors of solar heat gate coefficients of the fenestrations, and the air leakage results. Most importantly and frequently missing is the location of the thermal envelope. You need to show graphically where the line between the conditioned and unconditioned space is. This is done with the schematic planner section. It shows a delineation. So in this picture here, we see an unventilated attic, the thermal envelope, the ceiling joist. But the space just to the right of that, you got the same roof assembly, but it's actually part of the thermal envelope. And then when you go to the space just to the right of that, you can see that there's a plenum. Well, we need to know whether the bottom of the plenum or the top of the plenum is the thermal envelope, because I need to know whether the stuff in that plenum is insulated or uninsulated ductwork. So we need to have some kind of a schematic shown on the plan, and this is one of your 13 items that's required in Chapter 1 of the IECC to show us this information. So this diagram shows a good example of the diagrammatic method of how to show this. And it doesn't have to be overly fancy. We just need to show what you're doing and how you're doing it. So you've got a crawl space here that's unconditioned. So there's a thermal envelope in the floor in this one spot. And then you've got an unconditioned garage, which is not part of your thermal envelope. So this diagrammatic thing, if we have that, that's good enough. This is an example of an architect that submitted a set of plans that showed us where the thermal envelope and the air barrier was. So the air barriers are independent items that are also part of the thermal envelope because they prevent the uncontrolled airflow. So thermal barrier is required and the air barrier is required. The air leakage is part of the thermal envelope requirement, but the air barrier is its own separate item. And it needs to be treated as its own separate item as far as when you're detailing how to put it together. So similar to thermal envelope, we need to see how the air barrier moves around the building so it can be properly installed and inspected. Your energy inspectors, a lot of third-party inspections are required now for these. They need to know exactly what that air barrier is and how it goes. So when you see in this example, we needed to know whether that air barrier goes straight up the wall to the top of the roof or whether it actually extends around the eave. And in this case, it shows us where it extends around the eave. So we know where that air barrier is and where we should be looking for it as an inspector in the field. And then the detail falls a little short if you look at the upper right, because it tells us there's a continuous air barrier. It shows us it's on the outside, but it doesn't tell us what the material is being used for the air barrier. So is that material a Tyvek wrap? Is it building paper? Are they using plywood with seams in it? How is that being done? So here's another example of the air barrier location in a diagrammatic drawing. So if you look over here at the lawn terrace on the left, you see those pop-outs are not part of the air barrier. The air barrier slides behind the pop-outs. But if you look over here on the fitness center to the right, it's the opposite. The air barrier goes around the outside of the pop-outs, and the pop-outs are part of the conditioned space. So we need to know diagrammatically where that air barrier and thermal envelope is so that we make sure that it's being installed in the right place when it gets out to the field, and the energy raters that come out and do your inspections are actually making sure this thing is in the right spot. So again, it's another example of air barrier shown in the details, because we will need to show them not only diagrammatically to show how it moves around the building, but we need to show them in the details as well. So, and again, they can use plywood as an air barrier. There's a list of air barrier materials, but if you use plywood, you actually have to find a way to seal the edges. There's a plywood product out there I've seen called Zip Strip, to where it's a coated plywood product, and they have a tape strip that's applied when they do their shear, and that's unacceptable. You can use the building paper is acceptable. Where you are going to need to provide some kind of detailing is where if you're going to take a plywood air barrier and you're going to butt it up to the building paper air barrier, you need to show how that transition is done, how it's lapped, whether it's tape or caulking, or you're lapping the paper over the plywood, how you're doing that. You need to give us details on that, how that air barrier continuity is going to be maintained. So this one, I don't know if this is more of a Southern Nevada thing. I know that this is in the code on Chapter 11, but in Southern Nevada, or in Nevada in general, state law mandates we have baby changing tables. And so this is where this comes from. This has been a local amendment for quite a while, but it still gets missed on a daily basis. So this is written in response to state law requiring this to be installed. The only exception is facilities have been issued a permit or licenses that restrict administration of children. This doesn't include businesses with operational policies to restrict children. This would apply to bars, gentlemen clubs, and other adult businesses that are prohibited by law or ordinance from having allowing children. So an example of this is I had a guy coming to me with the Army, and they said, well, we're an Army recruiting center and we don't allow soldiers that are under 18. So we don't need a baby changing table because all of our soldiers are under 18. Right? But it's a recruiting center. They're going to come in there with families, and the family is the sister, the brother, the aunt, or whatever. They might have a baby with them. So it's not restricted that they can't be in there. So operationally does not cover it. If you have an operational need you think would be something special and out of the normal, you could try and do that as an alternate material methods request. But generally, unless it's an adult occupancy by law or statute, then you're going to be required to have that changing table in there. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up is the 24 code is now requiring adult changing stations. So I know you guys are mostly aware of the baby changing table requirements, but this is a new requirement. So as of January, when it's mandatory to use the 2024 codes here in Southern Nevada, these requirements are going to kick in. So the requirements on how to build these are in the 2017 version of the A117.1. So since we didn't adopt the 2018 and our amendments adopted the 2009 A117.1, and the state is also going to keep with the 2009 A117.1 requirements. So the requirements that actually tell you how to build these are not there. So if you want to get the requirements of these, you go to SNICC's website at snicc.org, and you can get the latest code amendments on there, and they'll give you all the sizes and stuff on how to build these and what the requirements are. These are going to take about 9 foot by 6 foot of space, floor space, and they're going to take 30 inches by 70 inches to actually put this changing table in, and they have to hold a 400-pound person on top of them. So they're significant. They are going to increase the size of your restrooms. I've listed here where they're required. So they're not required everywhere. So your assembly mercantile occupancies where family or assisted restrooms are required. Your type B occupancies where you got educational facilities above the 12th grade where there's 12 or more female or male water closets. And then you've got your education occupancies where there's an assembly area that requires 6 or more water closets. And this is the one I don't know how we're going to deal with because there's no actual definition of this in the code. And this isn't highways, rest stops, or highway service plazas. So as an industry, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to interpret that. So does a Love's truck stop that's got bathrooms and showers in it, is that considered a highway rest stop? And it also should be noted these cannot just go into the regular bathroom. They have to be in a single user bathroom. So you're in those cases, you're going to have to create a whole new bathroom. So this one, we haven't figured out how to deal with this highway rest stop and highway service plazas locally because, like I said, it's not a defined term. And so that one's going to be a little tricky. This is what these things look like. They're very big. They have to be adjustable in height from 17 inches above the ground to 38 inches above the ground. So they are going to be substantial. So just put that on your radar that these things are coming up. So another item that we see a lot of confusion on, I'd say that 85% of electric vehicle charging stations that get brought in are rejected the first time. So it seems that they're going in everywhere, but the codes do little address them at the current time. The accessibility requirements are vague and leave a lot of room for interpretation. So Southern Nevada has amended Section 1107.2 entirely, starting in 2018 code and continuing to the 24 code to put some standards in place for this. So the good news is that I worked with the Access Board, I worked with ICC, and I worked with a committee that's on the A117 Development and Adoption Committee to make sure that our revision here locally in Southern Nevada that's in the 24 amendments matches what's being put into the new A117.1 and follows the Access Board's recommendations. So that did get accepted for approval in the 2024 Group A code cycle for adoption in the 27. So after this code cycle, we shouldn't have to do an amendment anymore. We should actually have rules set in place for this. But the big takeaway that I need everybody to understand is that these are gas pumps for electricity. They're not parking spaces. So gas pumps are required to be accessible, but they're not dedicated to people with accessibility, and they don't have handicap accessible signs on them. EV charging stations are treated the same way as gas pumps. The complexity is sometimes these chargers are slow chargers where people park overnight and charge. So you cannot count these towards your required accessible parking spaces since they're only available to people with EVs and not the entire accessible community. If you want to count them as parking spaces, you need to also comply with all the requirements for accessible charging spaces while simultaneously complying with all the requirements for accessible parking spaces. This means that you need to be on the shortest accessible route to the main entry and must be provided with accessible signage and be dedicated for use by only accessible community. One of the common issues we see with these charging spaces is that the accessible access aisles are not in line with the charger. So you must provide access to the charger from the access aisle while the vehicle is connected, and the cord cannot block the accessible route. So if you look at these two examples here, all the EV in the first picture on the left, everything is over there, and they're strictly EV charging stations. They are not parking spaces. So you have your accessible parking spaces right there by the building entrance, and those EV parking spaces, while they do serve a building there, they do have to have an accessible route to the entrance of the building. If the other spaces in that property are able to get to that building, they do not have to be on the shortest accessible route like a parking space one. But if you look at the parking on the right side, you notice that they have EV parking spaces, and two of those accessible EV parking spaces are up against the building on the shortest accessible route. And they still have your required traditional accessible parking spaces for people that do not have EVs. So they have accessible EV charging spaces all the way out in the outer portions of the parking, but they also have EV parking spaces right there next to the building. So this is a common example of what we see on the plans. So if you notice that these EV chargers are facing the stall and they're centered on the actual parking space, or on the one on the right, they're actually centered on the line between two parking spaces. Well, I cannot get a wheelchair between the front of that equipment and where that car would be in the parking space. And here, if there's a curb on here, then my access stops at the curb. So even if there wasn't a curb, you can see that I don't have access to the front of that. So I don't have forward or side approach to the controls of that. So this is one of the things we see a lot, that this is the most common failure we see on these, is that there is not an accessible route to get to those controls while a car is parked in the space. So these are two examples of how it works. If you look at the one on the right, it's similar to the other situation that was not compliant, but you notice they've turned that EV charger sideways to where now the controls are available to the access aisle, and then the access aisle does go up over that curb with a flat zero curb. But more appropriately, to where you have this dual head unit on the left, where it's in the middle of the access aisle, it can serve two accessible spaces at one time, and the accessible route goes right up to it, and the cord does not block you from getting to it. So That's all I've got for today. Looks like I'm about out of my time. I'm going to hand this over to Mike. But before I do that, does anybody have any questions on some of the stuff or anything else they'd like to discuss?
There are some questions in the Q&A, Alan.
Oh my gosh.
Those?
I apologize. This thing does not auto scroll. So
So I
I
don't know if
have
you
to
want to take some of
apologize.
those now and then some
Yeah,
more.
so
Yeah.
this one says I'm in office building B, occupancy, gross area gives me 49 occupants. Do I need to show occupant load for individual rooms? Yes. So I will need the occupant load for individual rooms on those. It doesn't matter what kind of occupancy it is, because for me to fully evaluate that, I need to know all of those occupancy types and all those occupancy load factors that you're using, so I can make sure that all the rooms are getting accounted correctly. And then we can deal with the 49 business occupants and whether it pushes that 50 threshold or not. And then for the prescriptive assembly, the assembly can only be up to 1 hour assembly. No, there are prescriptive assemblies that will get you higher than 1 hour. It does get more challenging, but there are some higher than 1 hour assemblies in there. And then when you look at those assemblies, they're very specific to where you can and can't use them. So the type of assemblies you're using and what it's doing is affected. The prescriptive requirements are affected, whether it's a corridor wall, it has different rated assemblies, or whether it's a barrier, it has different assemblies. So just check that. Some cities impose priorities on types of projects for the building department, such as affordable housing projects. Has Clark County received any mandates of priorities on projects to review by timeframes by legislative bodies? Thank you for the great presentation. Well, I thank you for that part. It's a little bit of a different vibe here, trying to do it over a video screen where I'm staring at a slideshow instead of your faces, but it is a challenge. So we are seeing pressure. We don't have any specific requirements for affordable housing, but we are seeing pressure to work on more of this tiny housing, tiny home stuff, and trying to figure out ways to get that in there. There actually is a governing body in Nevada right now that has put out a task force to try and find ways to find things in the building code that we can remove to make the construction of houses more affordable, to reduce the overall cost of housing. But the only legislative one I know of right now that really puts a restriction on timeframes for reviews is there is a federal guideline on cell phone towers and communication towers. So we have, and I'm not going to give you the number because I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's not a very long time. We have a certain amount of time to get the review completed and approved. And if we don't get that review and completed and approved within that time frame, then it automatically gets approved. So that's the only one I know of that's actually done by legislation on the time frame of our review. But there are things that you can do expedited reviews on. But typically with Clark County, our review times are pretty short. So the typical review on a smaller project is 14 calendar days from the time that you submitted in to us to the time that the reviews is due to be complete. So holidays and weekends count against us, not you. So the review times in Clark County are typically not where we see the holdup. And the issue comes into what happens before you get to the building department and how that process goes and how long that takes, or more importantly, how long it takes us to get the responses back on comments and how deep the comments are on that first round. And then says sometimes use IBC section 722.6 to build our own fire rate assemblies. Do you find that acceptable? Absolutely. It is a little bit more challenging for us to review. So when you do build those out of 722.6, it is absolutely a viable code path, but we need you to detail where you're getting that information. Tell us what table it's coming from and tell us which path you're using to get that. Just throwing it on the plans and calling it a rated assembly, we're not going to do that. We need you to tell us what path you're using with a little narrative on it, or which table you're using. Put that information in that details of that particular assembly you're trying to build, and we will absolutely accept items out of 722.6. And then does county still require a fireproofing schedule that show thickness for each steel profile when using spray applied fireproofing? Yes, we do. So there should be a fireproofing plan that shows you the thickness of the fireproofing for each material, and it should have the tables and the layouts. But yes, that is still a requirement. That doesn't come through the building department so much as it comes through the fire department, because in Clark County, the fire department is now, the fire planner is now part of the fire department instead of the building department. But yes, that is still a requirement. And then for conference room break rooms that are less than 750 square feet and a larger business office suite, tenant improvement, should we use the business occupant load factor of 1 to 150 gross for those areas, or should we use a 1 to 15 net increase the occupancy load and increase the amount of plumbing fixtures? Increase the occupancy load. This is a long question. We increase the occupancy load, we can separate those assembly areas out separately in the code analysis, plumbing fixture count requirements, business water clouds per occupants. Okay, so I think I'm understanding this question. So if your conference room is less than 750 square feet, it is never going to be allowed to be 1 to 150 gross business area, because it is not a business area. It is still an assembly area. So it will always be 1 to 15 or less. We typically allow 1 to 15 on all conference rooms. We never make you do a standing room only, because we assume there's going to be tables and chairs in a conference room. But I think what you're getting at on this question is, do I have to size the water closets based off of the assembly occupancy or the business occupancy, because the assembly occupancy is less restrictive? And the answer is no. So when you do your plumbing fixture analysis, you're going to do a hybrid analysis. So you're going to take the number of occupants that are assembly, you're going to divide that number by, I'm going to say 75, because that's your typical assembly person per fixture count. You're going to get a factor, and you're going to say it's going to be a 0.2 toilets is required. Then you're going to take your business area, you're going to take your business occupancy, and you're going to get a factor that says like maybe 1.2 toilets is required. You're going to add the 1.2 and the 0.2, and that's going to tell you need 1.4 toilets. So that now you need to provide 2 toilets. So hopefully that is the question or answer. I apologize. I did not see these rolling in while we're on the fly. I would much rather have handled these while they came in, but I'm a little bit behind. Do rated walls have to be physically labeled in the field? Yes, they do. So the rated assemblies have to be stenciled. There's a requirement in the code. They have to be stenciled with what they are. And it has a requirement for the size and the stroke of the letters. They have to be above the ceiling, but they only have to be stenciled above there when there's an accessible ceiling. So if you have a grid ceiling, or if you have access panels in a hard lid ceiling, you do need to label the firewalls above those ceilings. So if anybody ever gets in the ceiling, they're aware. And yes, that is in the code. So I believe the exterior doors have to have at least 24 inches on the pull side. No, not that I'm aware of. The pull side would still be 18 inches in most cases. There are cases where if you're coming as a side approach or something like that, you could be required to do 24. But as far as the base code goes and the A117.1 goes, there's nothing about an exterior door that is different from the interior door, to my knowledge. And in dealing with common path of travel from a mezzanine, 75 common path would be acceptable to get off the mezzanine with 1 exit, and the rest would be limited to travel distance. Yes and no. So your common path of travel goes all the way to the point you have a choice of 2 exits. So if the bottom of that stair, once I get to the bottom of that stair from the mezzanine, if I could see 2 exits from that point, my common path would stop there, and then it would just be an exit travel distance problem from that point. But the mezzanine common path would stop as soon as those people from that mezzanine had a choice of 2 exits, and hopefully by the time we get to the bottom of that, they would. Pocket door rules also apply to barn doors. Barn doors are not so much of a problem, because the barn doors, the hardware is in front, and they typically are on the wall, so you don't have them sticking into the opening, and the openings on barn doors are usually more than a 32-inch minimum opening anyways. But yes, if the hardware on the barn door did prevent it from being opened without, the way I describe it is, if you don't have a hand, can you still open it and operate the hardware? And that's what the code's trying to do. So if I have a stump and I don't have fingers in a wrist, can I still open that? That's a good rule of thumb to determine whether your hardware complies. And then it's just a matter, does the barn door open up far enough? So Similar, but I don't see as many problems on barn doors as I do pocket doors. Pocket doors, about 90% of the time, they're non-compliant in the first go round, but barn doors are typically okay. So when does the increase in diameter from 60 to 67 inches take effect? This is a question about the A117.1 requirements. That is going to take effect when the 2017 A117.1 is adopted, and that is not going to be adopted by the state or locally down here in Southern Nevada until at least the 2027 code cycle. And I want to put a caveat on that, saying if there's any additional laws that are passed, or there's always stuff that politicians and people can do in the interim, but as of right now, the state has decided that we're going to stay with that 2009, specifically because a lot of the funding is allocated for these buildings that are designed with the 60 inches, and it would require redesigns to go to the 67 for the 2017 version. That is why it didn't get adopted here locally. And the Department of Justice, it should be noted, did not change to 67 yet. This is only an A117, which is not a law. It's just a standard. So the Department of Justice is still at 60, and we are still at 60 locally. So hopefully that answers your question. And then please speak on the requirements for the deeper jambs, for example, furred out masonry wall with 12-inch metal frame. I'm assuming this is talking about your door requirements. If you look at that door section in A117.1, that door section does have alcove requirements. I did not show that slide, but it's just the next page in the book. Will show that if you have more than 12 inches into an alcove, then you actually do get a little bit wider requirements for your doors. A typical furred out masonry wall, you might get to that 12 inches, and if you do, because the door is typically centered in that wall, so you're typically not going to get to that 12 inches. You're typically going to have somewhere around 6 on each side or 4 on each side or something like that. So you're not going to be too deep to where it changes it. But once you get to a certain point, go back to your A117.1. It does actually change your maneuver and clearance requirements of that door. Will ASHRAE still be an alternative on 2024 IECC? I'm going to caveat this with I'm not 100% sure on this one, but my understanding is yes, it still is. And what is the enforcement on commissioning? That one. So commissioning, as far as I know, the commissioning hasn't changed. It's a tonnage limit once it gets to a certain size system, and each jurisdiction is going to have their own size system on when that commissioning comes in. But as far as the energy code, I'm not sure that the energy code has any specific requirements on the commissioning, other than it has to meet certain efficiency levels and things like that. But that is an answer that, if you want to ask me a specific question in the email, I could try and drill down and get you a better answer on that one. And what is the best approach for slab insulation in Southern Nevada? The best approach, in my opinion, is to wait till 2024, because Southern Nevada, we did amend out slab edge insulation finally for the 2024 code. But as far as right now, the footing has to be 24 inches deep, because I need 24 inches of insulation. So the typical 18-inch deep footing doesn't work anymore. So I got to do that 24-inch rigid board insulation on the outside. What I've seen in the field is they're putting an actual metal cap, sheet metal cap over there to paint the same color as the house and protect the insulation for the above grade portion. And then it's exposed to the dirt on the below grade portion. But typically it's a rigid board just attached with glue or fasteners to the footing and poured kind of into the foundation. But that is actually 24 minutes is going away, which is good. How am I doing on time? Do I have enough time here for more? I don't want to take time away from Mike here, so I'm going to try and go a little quicker to get through these. Or is it not a requirement due to the frost being shallow? I think that goes to the last question for Christian. That is why we amended it out. We don't really have a frost problem, and in Southern Nevada, it's really hot, so we would actually like our slabs to get some cool from the ground to put in our buildings. So functionally, it doesn't really change. It doesn't really help us much here, but it costs us money for not a lot of benefits. So that's why we, as a committee, decided to get rid of that. So no parking spaces or not accessible parking spaces. So if you call it a parking space, we're going to require it to meet all the requirements of parking space. This is going back to the EV question. So yes, if you call it a parking space instead of an EV charging space, it will be treated as an EV charging space and as a parking space, and it'll have to meet the rules of both simultaneously. So what is the ruling on accessible EV charging stations and access around them? We have issues with this in California. What is Nevada? I'm not sure what that question is, Saki, but if you can email me, we can get in touch and I could talk to you more. I know California has had its own requirements. We actually wrote our requirements to try and be in line with California's originally, but we decided that that was actually killing the EV rollout because California is requiring them to put accessible signage on there. And in most places, if you put accessible signage on a parking space, then it's a $500 fine if you park in that space without a handicap placard, which rendered a lot of those EV charging spaces not usable. And so the utilization rate would be so low that it was no longer a cost-efficient item to install because they could not get a return on their investment for a station that never got used. So that's why we put in the accessible space use last signage into this new code language and into our local amendment so that you can still have an accessible space, but we just encourage people to use it last, but it's open to everybody so that they can get the utilization rates on those to increase the speed at which they roll out the accessible parking space, the accessible chargers and the infrastructure. This one, construction defects are most commonly related to water penetration. Why is it that building officials don't require significant requirements for design and inspection of construction documents to prevent water intrusion and hints between adjacent assemblies such as roofing? This one is getting more into a legal question, which I don't want to get into in this forum. The waterproofing requirements in the code are not really as well defined as some of these other requirements are. The water stuff is not present in the like it is in the energy code. We have some very vague stuff. It's very hard for us as a jurisdiction to actually point to code sections and enforce it. We do try to make sure that we have some water stuff in there, but it is definitely a highly litigious area that we tread lightly on. Then I've got a required amount of EVCS inclusive of ADA units. I do not know. So this question, I'm sorry, I'm deciphering the acronyms here. So are the required EV charging stations inclusive of ADA units? No. So the EV charging stations would not matter if there's an ADA unit around or not. You would still have to have a certain amount of them be accessible, at least one. I think it's at least 1 or 5% the way it's currently written, but it does not matter. You don't have to have an ADA unit to require it. And here locally in Clark County, we just adopted a code in January for our administrative code and our zoning code that requires you to have not only EV charging installed, but you also have to have EV ready spaces. So that's a different thing, but no, it has nothing to do with whether there's ADA units involved. This could be any property. And I'm going to have to cut this short in about 4 minutes to give Mike time. And if we have extra time at the end, then I'll get back and see if I get any I didn't catch. Required proactive mock-up water testing for horizontal podium, waterproofing, window door, mock installations. I'm not sure what that question's asking there, Jeff. And then I've got another one about wood assemblies, maximum fire resistance rating. This is where it says 1 hour is for wood construction. Thanks for the information. Okay. Keep in mind that there are other assemblies in that prescriptive requirement besides wood assemblies. So you can use metal studs and other materials in there. So you can use concrete, masonry, other stuff. So do doors of smoke partition need to have gaskets on the frame to limit the passage of smoke? Yes. So there is a misnomer that a lot of people misunderstand on smoke partitions, on smoke doors in general. But yes, a smoke partition does have to have a gasketed frame, but the sweep does not have to seal. The only time that we're required to have a sweep on the bottom of a door is if there is a shaft where there could be smoke coming from the floor below, or if it's a pressurized compartment. And then at the pressurization boundary, I would need to have a sweep smoke seal at that. But all of the frames on the sides and top must be gasketed for the passage of smoke. If airports are A3, what occupancy are airport lounges considered for calculating water closet counts? So water closet counts are like occupancy load factors. They're not calculated based off of the occupancy classification of the building. They're based off the usage of the space. So you're going to take however many people you have as assembly areas, and you notice those classifications that are in that table in chapter 29 do not match with occupancy classification. They have different names and different factors. So you're going to do those water closet counts based on the use of those spaces. And oh, look, it's Mark McGinty, my old boss there. Good to see you here, Mark. And that is the last of the questions I got. So I'm going to hand this over to my partner here, Michael Clifford, and he's going to go over some residential issues.
Okay, Mike, anytime you want to share your slides, we're ready to go.
Okay, I think, is this correct?
Yes, there we are.
Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity to present to you guys today. My name is Mike Clifford. I do combination plans at the City of Las Vegas. And I'm currently First Vice President of the Southern Nevada Chapter of International Code Council. My background is I was a carpenter for about 25 years, building inspector for about 7, and the last couple of years now as plans examiner. So, and my presentation today, I based it on the 18 International Residential Code, and I kind of did a little bit. Little similar, well, I guess a little bit different than Alan's. These are the real basic things that we always see on the plans. But you will see some very similar things than Alan's presentation. So, like I said, yep, it's based on the most common residential plan review correction items. The real basic ones too. Code analysis. Usually the incorrect adopted codes, but most of these can be found on our website. Most jurisdictions, they post everything that we've been adopted to. Another one is reference to the wrong jurisdiction or states, plans that get moved from state to state, or they just don't get updated when they get submitted. And then sometimes we get the wrong occupancy on there. And just a kind of example of the requirements for what the adopted codes are. Code amendments. We have a lot of code amendments in Southern Nevada, especially at the City of Las Vegas. We do amend a lot of codes, and we actually amend them, and we actually remove code sections. So it's very important to verify, especially when you're submitting your plans. We have permit techs at the City of Las Vegas. Those are your resource. Those are the people you should contact to make sure. But you can usually get them all on the website. And it's very important because this could be significant changes to the code, or like I said, or they could be entirely deleted. Detailed scope of work. Very important for us. And also for the inspector in the field, right? The more information you can give us, absolutely the best. Especially when we have a set of plans that comes in and we can look already and say, okay, now I know what we're doing. It could be difficult when we start going through plans and we find, oh, there's a lot more things that they're doing here. It's just much easier if it's in the scope of work. In the planning, building planning, plot plan. Please provide these dimensions so we can verify really for the fire separation distance we have to the property lines. We use this, also planning uses this, so it's very important information that we do need. And I put the two tables in there just on the ratings if you're sprinklered or non-sprinklered, especially with the distance separation in there. Very common. These are very common, definitely with accessory structures that we're getting now. Very common to go multiple reviews because we didn't get this information, and then when they find out they're less than 5 feet or 3 feet, what the requirements are. Just an example of a plot plan. The more information, the better. We use this, and planning uses this. Planning wants to know a lot of times the distance from the structure to the existing house. We really worry a lot about the property lines. Fire rated assemblies when we need it based on fire separation. Very similar to what Alan touched on. The biggest thing is give us the complete listing. When you look at those listings, if you're just taking off the number or you're giving us something like what's on this screen right now, you're really kind of hindering yourself, and it's hindering the guys in the field and the inspector because there's so many more options to achieve that rating if you give the whole complete listing. And another thing is try to find the latest version. And also, these numbers change from time to time. What this design number was 10 years ago could be a totally different design now. Oops, sorry. So here's just more part of a full listing. So like I said, it's given you, the designer and the installer, many more options to achieve that rating, especially if you have one that you can use many more materials from. Coordination of plans. This is probably one of the biggest ones. The architectural, the mechanical, and the plumbing electrical. Typically, the architectural will have most of the information, and then the mechanical has different things added. The plumbing has different things added, or the electrical. It's that coordination between the plans, and sometimes we might catch it on one review, and then you have to go back and kind of do a whole review over because certain information was added to one or the other. And you know, this could be a challenge, especially when you have multiple designers on one set of plans. So very, very common. Emergency escape and window openings. This one is commonly missed. You just got to give us the size and the type of on the window on the plans. Especially we get tons of additions that come through, or we're changing things, changing lofts or closets or additions to bedrooms. We got to verify those windows. You got to give us the sizes. You know, 5'7" or 5 if you're on the grade below. And I forgot to add, but you know, the minimum, we need to know that too for the minimum opening size for the type. Attic ventilation, another one, especially with additions, new plans, everything. We need to know those calculations, and based on if you're going to do it on the 1 to 150 or 1 to 300. If you're using the baffle style with events, you know, show us details and then let us know on the plans if you're going to do the vented or non-venting insulation.
Hey, Mike, we've got a couple of questions here. If you want to take a quick minute. So one of them is, what is the square footage parameters for fire sprinklers in a single family home? Does this vary per jurisdiction? You want to answer for the city of Las Vegas, Mike?
Sure. So City of Las Vegas, we require sprinklers in all residential now. And that's typically through the fire department. That's their requirement now. So I couldn't speak on any other jurisdiction. But we, since like 2019, 2020, everything that we do is fully sprinklered now.
And I know that Clark County is now also fully sprinklered on all single family residential. And City of Henderson was the first one in the valley to adopt residential fire sprinklers, and they have been fully sprinkled in all residential occupancies for quite a while now. I think going back at least 9 years. When it comes to Boulder City and North Las Vegas, I don't have the answer, but I'm pretty sure that North Las Vegas is adopting it mandatory, but it does vary by jurisdiction to answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
But the three jurisdictions, the City of Las Vegas, City of Henderson, and Clark County, as of today, all residential in those jurisdictions will have to be fire sprinkled. And then you have another question there, Mike. It's about the HOA. Can you see that one?
I can't see it. Sorry, Alan.
So it says, if you believe the HOA architectural committee is violating FHA standards by not allowing reasonable accommodations for height variance for an elevator to the roof, will local building department override and accept plans that did not get a variance of ACC stamp? So we do not inspect to HOA standards. We do not review to FHA standards or HOA standards. We only review to what is required in the IRC and the IBC and A117.1. So if they have a standard, it's a federal requirement, where FHA does have a lot of special requirements and the VA has special requirements. We don't enforce those, and we won't require those. We only enforce the adopted codes, and those can be found on all of our jurisdictional websites as to what the current adoption codes and regulations are. So hopefully that answers that one. And then you've got another one that says, does Southern Nevada building officials still prepare initial amendments for many jurisdictions in Clark County? So there is an amendment process that if we could get more participation, it would be very, very helpful. But we have amendment committees when a new code comes out. So the next one, the 2027 code, when that first gets published, we will reconvene our amendment committees. There's about 9 different committees. They have IRC committees, a swimming pool committee, the electrical committee. I was on 4 or 5 of those committees myself. We really do need more participation from the AIA. Carlos with AIA was with us on some of those, and he can fill you guys in on what that looks like. But we do the amendments in those amendment committees, and we get people from all over Southern Nevada. We get jurisdictional members voting, and we get industry members voting. So we have a split 50-50 between jurisdictional and industry members for voting members. And we try and get in quorums of subject matter experts to do that stuff. Snowball then reviews our requests for amendments, and they come back with the changes and adjustments they want to see. We make those changes at their behest, and then those get adopted and published. Now, it should be noted that each jurisdiction has a slightly different adoption. So, for instance, Clark County still has the high rise amended down to 50-foot maximum to be in line with state fire marshal, and the other jurisdictions have chosen to stay with the code minimum 75 feet. So there are nuances to the individual jurisdictions' version of the amendments. So when you're in a jurisdiction, I would encourage you to look at that specific jurisdiction's website for their copy of the adopted amendments. And then we've got how many fire emergency exits are required for a single family residential unit? What are the requirements for those emergency paths leading to the public street? Want to take that one, Mike? So there is only,
I mean, just your main egress door to your house is the only thing that's required for single family.
Yeah, there is only one egress door required in a single family residence under the IRC. There is no requirement outside of a single egress door. And that egress door is to the outside. So you don't have exit access doors in a path of egress travel like you do in the IBC. The IRC only requires that one egress door per house. And then some UL assemblies have multiple ways to achieve desired rating. Is this needed to be designed in the documents or designated in the documents, or is it acceptable to leave to the contractor and allow some flexibility for different contracts that is used in different methods within the UL detail? I've been asked for this by other AHJs. Yeah, so if you get, can you see the questions, Mike?
I cannot. I apologize. Oh,
So keep going, Mike. I'm going to try and digest this one, and
sure.
I'll answer to your next pause.
Oh, this is just a diagram of the attic ventilation again. So just kind of show you some calculations, and on the roof plan, we're showing us where the vents are going to be, what type, and the size of them, and the calculations for the size that we need. Communication, this is, I would say, number one. Alan touched on this. Provide correspondence letter on revisions and resubmittals, clearly stating what's been corrected or revised. Identify with clouded areas. Very common to not to be included or very vague information. Yeah, it's difficult when we get plans that come back and we don't really, the things might have been changed, but there's no way of us knowing what's been corrected or been revised. So the more information you can give us on that correspondence letter, or however you want to do it, we ask for a correspondence letter, and just give us the information and tell us what page, and the more the better. If we get one that comes back and say items have been corrected, okay. But it sure would be nice if we can get a little bit more correspondence and more details for that. If you ever have questions, please email or phone. The more we can communicate, the better. I mean, the way I look at it is we're partners in this. I'd much rather take a phone call from somebody than write out a very lengthy email, which can be complicated and trying to explain things. It's so much easier to talk to somebody on the phone. Or I know face-to-face is kind of phasing out. But that communication is key. I mean, we're partners. We're partners in this. You know, all of our backgrounds are diverse. All jurisdictions now are going to combination everything. I was a combination inspector, combination plans examiner. Typically our backgrounds are from one trade or one field of expertise. So a lot of this we're learning. And a lot of this, some types of plans we only see once or twice a year. So we really have to go back and do our research. If we get something that comes in that's new, or rarely seen. So the more communication we have, the better. And I will say, I've had designers call me and engineers who are very familiar with specific projects, and they actually help me get through the process of these things because they want to be partners and they want to help. So it's just much easier for them to get their plans through, and I appreciate that because we're all trying to learn and do this together. So like I said, let's be partners.
So I've had an issue just the other day, and this is not the first time this has come up, but I had a guy call me. He was just super frustrated with what I was asking him to do, and he just didn't understand it. And what it came down to, it was just a miscommunication. He was not understanding what I was asking for, and I wasn't understanding what he was trying to accomplish. So once we got on the phone, he told me what he was trying to accomplish, and I could see the path. He was trying to just force pegs into holes to get what he wanted to work, to be able to work, but he didn't know how to put that down. So once we got on the phone, we were able to communicate. We were able to find a path that worked, and it was actually very easy. And we've been frustrated with each other for like 2 or 3 rounds of comments. And all it took was a quick phone call to get on the same page. So if you guys are feeling frustrated or you feel like you're not understanding what your plans examiners are asking for, pick up the phone or send an email and ask if you can have a meeting. I know at Clark County, we have a very open door policy that you should be able to come down and meet the plans examiner or get them on the phone pretty much anytime. So those, like Mike said, those communication things, I know that, you feel like it's always a no when you call us, and we really don't want you to feel like that. We want you to call because a lot of times it's just a misunderstanding between us and you of what you're trying to accomplish, and the path you're going, you think might be the easiest path, but there might be another option that you're just not seeing that we can help you with.
Yeah, good points, Alan. I would say I probably only get emails or phone calls on maybe 5% of the plan reviews that get denied. We just wait for the next submittal to come in, and it's kind of a shame sometimes because it really delays the process. And next thing you know, you guys are getting more fees put on you for a third review. Where, just the more communication, the better.
We got 2 questions in here, Mike. I've got
Okay.
one for the UL assemblies. I understand this one now, Todd. So you're asking if you have a UL assembly and it's got multiple compliance paths, i.e. different framing methods or different membrane methods, whether it be drywall or Durarock or something like that, do you actually have to pick and designate which method you're using on a detail? No. If the detail gives the option to build any of those, that listed assembly, if you build it per any one of those options in the field, those options are all you're available. We do not make you designate which one you use on a UL detail. As long as that the one you're using complies with the construction type. Obviously, if it allowed you to use a wood stud or a metal stud and you're a type 1 or a type 2 building, we obviously wouldn't allow the wood stud. But no, you do not need to designate that. And this one, it doesn't feel like it's a question, more of an informational thing from Roger Scott. It says Northern Nevada has a new code for the residents to be 5,000 square foot under roof for sprinklers. So in Northern Nevada, to answer a previous question, it looks like there is a 5,000 square foot begin sprinklers in single family residential in Northern Nevada.
I just want to add back to the listing. When you guys are selecting those listings, it would be in your best option to not pick a proprietary one. Pick one that's non-proprietary. It gives you a lot more options, especially when we have shortages with materials or you just never know. So give yourself more options with not being the proprietary one. So just some final takeaways. Code analysis, make sure you have the correct adopted codes and occupancy, code amendments, verify. Those changes could be significant or they could be deleted. Detailed scope of work, give us the exact work being performed per discipline. That would be very helpful. Plot plan, provide with dimensions to verify fire separation. Coordination of all those plans together. Emergency escape and rescue windows, provides the size and type. Attic ventilation, provide calculations, roof layout. Fire rated assemblies, provide the entire most current listing and our communication. One thing I would like to talk about, and we really appreciate everybody for letting us come here today. Our chapter really appreciates it. Our education person, Andrew Kelly, has made this connection with you guys. And we'd like to promote more education that we do through our chapter. We do EduCode. So EduCode's going into its 29th year. I'm sure a lot of people, you guys are aware, but it was started in the 90s from this chapter when it was really discussed and started training needs for Southern Nevada. Currently, EduCode is our premier educational conference, offering more than 100 different courses. And the attendance has grown to 1,500 virtual and 1,200 people every year, and it continues to grow. So in EduCode, we offer training and networking for building and fire inspectors, plan examiners, permit techs, code enforcement, managers, supervisors, architects, engineers, building officials, and all code professionals. And you can get your CEUs for ICC, IAPMO, and AIA.
And a shameless plug, I'm going to be doing an introduction to building plan review class. It'll be an 8-hour class at EduCode. And we're going to get into detail about specifically how we go through a plan review and what we're looking for, how we're determining the occupancy classifications, the areas, the heights, the fire ratings, the accessibility requirements. So if you do have some junior members of your firm, or if you have some people that just want to understand what the plan review process looks like and maybe get a better understanding of the code paths and analysis that we go through, I think it would be helpful for a lot of your members to understand what this side of the fence looks like to be able to better prepare from your side of the fence on your deliverables.
Just another slide here, Alan. So here's EduCode. Here's a QR code. This will take you right to our classes, registration, and accommodations if you're coming out of town. We hold this at the Orleans Casino every year. You can go to our EduCode website and get all the information and kind of history of ours. And but the QR code would take you directly to registering for next year's event.
And we do have a decent amount of questions kind of in the queue here, Mike.
Okay. Oh, let me go.
So here's one that, does this make sense to you, Mike? Do you have something called a bucket in your plan review process?
Those are just where we put their reviews.
Okay, yeah. So this is a question specifically for you. It's been my experience with the Las Vegas response to City of Las Vegas plan check comments is that a bucket for architectural comments is not provided. I have to call and ask that a bucket for my narrative be provided.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that we typically add to the review at the end. If it's been missed or not open for you, I apologize. That's where the permit text can help. If you have questions, you can always just email them and they'll open it for you.
And then we've got one here. I don't think this is a question. I think this is more of a comment, but it says it's refreshing to know that you folks are available for real-time discussions. Agreed, the volume of email strings has its constraints. Not so with third-party plan reviewers. Cheers.
Yeah. I just want to say I appreciate that. I think Alan and myself and a lot of us, we come from the field. So we weren't just plans examiners. We have a lot of practical experience in the field, and you look at the common sense part of it too, combined with code. So I appreciate that comment.
And then we've got a comment here that says almost all Northern Nevada jurisdictions have different requirements for fire sprinklers. You must check with the fire jurisdiction before making assumptions, which goes into another question that says, does the 5,000 square foot Northern Nevada include garage covered patio, living space, etc.? I agree with Nathan that you do need to check with your jurisdiction to find out what those specific requirements in Northern Nevada are. I am not equipped to answer questions on Northern Nevada's fire sprinkler requirements because I'm not educated on that topic. So for Northern Nevada, Southern Nevada, we've got a little bit more information for you. Northern Nevada, you're going to have to reach out to those jurisdictions. And then another one says, I was informed the inspector by state requirement, fire sprinklers required for all habitable structures as of March 5th of this year is what I heard. Correct. That's not my understanding. So they're all habitable and would assume that we would be going retrofitting fire sprinklers at existing buildings. And just because we put an addition on a building doesn't necessarily mean it's fire sprinkler, and we're not going and making people retrofit. So I don't feel that on the face is accurate. There may be some validity to what you heard, but I have not heard that myself. Are there code education courses offered for Washoe County, Reno, and Sparks? There is going to be the annual business meeting for the International Code Council is going to be held next year in October in Reno. And so everybody nationally is going to come there, and they will have some code classes up there. But, you know, I just want to point out that Reno and Sparks is only about 6.5 to 7 hours from Las Vegas, and we've got extra hotel rooms down here for you to come to EduCode in February. So we could use you down here. And you also want to get with your chapter up there. You do have a Northern Nevada chapter of the International Code Council, and you can get with the Northern Nevada Building Officials Association and find out what kind of training opportunities they have up there. I'm sure that they do have some stuff. Mike, do you have a link to them by chance, or a webpage you can get for them?
I don't know. I mean, maybe through our Southern Nevada chapter, we have through NOBO, which is the Northern Building Officials, but I'm not sure on that.
And then Santiago, you're asking us the previous AI presentation, it said one of the barriers to consider is the complexity of inconsistencies in code that needs constant review and interpretations. Any insight on how ICC is contemplating the process? Not really, but I know ICC is spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to incorporate AI. They are incorporating AI into their digital codes now, to where you can use an AI tool in the online digital codes through ICC. So if you are a member of the digital codes with ICC, that they do have an AI function they're integrating. The challenge is that every jurisdiction adopts its own code. So out here in the West Coast, for instance, we typically adopt IATMO codes, UPC and UMC, where other parts of the countries adopt the IPC and the IMC. So it's going to be very difficult to make those things square, because the code requirements of the IBC that point you to the IPC don't necessarily point to the exact same spot in the UPC, and the requirements are different. So there is going to be a reckoning at some point, and AI is going to be probably part of that conversation, but it's too early in the process for us to know exactly how that's going to work. And we had another excellent presentation. Appreciate working with you over the years. Thank you both. With the new restrictions to the IRC regarding the IECC, that's is the res check path to compliance now retired? Not to my knowledge. The res check path is still a path. There is a little bit of confusion on whether that res check is part of the prescriptive path or the performance path. And so I'm not exactly sure how all that's working, but res check is not dead. It's still accepted in our plan reviews on a daily basis. And most of our plan reviews come in with either a res check or a com check. But like I said, it's such a new process that a lot of us jurisdictions are still trying to sort through all that on our end as well. Working with building officials has been great, but working with a third-party reviewers has been nightmarish. So, well, that's one for our team, Mike. So, one commenter said that the third party was easier to communicate with. This guy's saying the building departments are easier to communicate. You know, it comes down to all of us are people. We all have different levels of expertise. We all have different professional experiences. One reviewer might be really good at one part of the job, and another reviewer might be good at another part of the job. A lot of those third-party guys came from jurisdictions. They retired and come out. So I think there's good in both. We've all got our challenges and we've all got our wins, but I appreciate the fact that you think the building officials are doing a good job. We think our building officials doing a fantastic job personally. So as res check, we did the res check. Can I utilize provisions of ICC Lab E119 1-hour test for performance of certain parts of an assembly, such as short drywall screw fastener length performance with the addition of shear panel and screw is not lengthened accordingly? So I'm not sure I totally understand your question, Robert, but it sounds like what you're doing is you're looking for an engineering judgment, or you're looking for a performance path. But it sounds like if you're doing testing to prove a concept, then you're either going to get a listing, but more likely probably just an engineering judgment that would come in as an alternate material methods request. And if it's stamped by a fire protection engineer and there's valid logic behind it and it's reasonable, then typically those engineering judgments have a pretty high success rate. Any residential new single-family roof drainage requirements? Not that I'm aware of. You, Mike?
I think so.
Thanks. My job is to make your job easier. That was from Ken. Northern Nevada International Code Council president is Mark Miranda. So for those that are looking in Northern Nevada, if Stacy, you could share this in the chat, but it's M Miranda, MMERANDA at cityofsparks.us.
Okay, I will share that in the lobby chat during our break.
Yeah, I will say too, if you're looking for classes that are not supplied where you are, we do all our stuff virtual for EduCode. So please review our catalog. There's something for everybody.